"You don't belong here. Just do your job and stay quiet," the man said, loud enough to turn a $10,000 dinner into a stage. And just like that, the air inside the crystal-lit restaurant shifted, glasses paused mid-air, conversations dissolved into whispers, and at the center of it all stood Maya Brooks, a young black waitress holding a silver tray with hands steadier than her heartbeat, her posture straight, her eyes calm, but her silence louder than anything in the room, because she had heard it all before: the subtle tones, the forced smiles, the words wrapped in politeness but sharpened with intent. And still she didn't react, not because she was weak, but because she had learned that dignity doesn't beg for space. It claims it quietly. While across the room, seated at a table reserved for power, Ethan Cole watched everything unfold, a billionaire known for building companies worth billions before most people finished college. A man who understood leverage, control, and timing better than anyone in that room. And yet, in this moment, he wasn't studying numbers or deals. He was watching a different kind of transaction, one that had nothing to do with money. Maya moved again, placing a glass gently on the table as the man waved his hand dismissively, not even looking at her, the kind of gesture that said more than words ever could. And a few guests chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than speaking up, easier than breaking the invisible rule that power protects itself. But Ethan didn't laugh. He leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in recognition, because he had seen this before, in boardrooms, in back alleys of negotiation, in moments where people revealed exactly who they were when they thought no one important was watching. And that was the mistake. They thought no one important was watching. The music continued softly in the background, a jazz melody trying to smooth over the tension that now hung thick like humidity before a storm. Maya turned to leave, her steps measured, her expression unchanged, but something in the room had already shifted, something subtle, something irreversible, because dignity, once witnessed, has a way of exposing everything else. And Ethan Cole, the man who could buy the entire building without blinking, realized in that quiet, heavy second that tonight was no longer about the deal sitting on the table. It was about something far more expensive, something no one in that room could afford to ignore. And he slowly placed his glass down, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting, not for another insult, not for another laugh, but for a decision, the kind that doesn't just change a night, but rewrites the balance of power entirely. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if one wrong breath could shatter it. And Maya felt it on her skin before she even turned around. That shift in the room when attention stops drifting and starts locking in. She kept walking, one step, then another, her grip steady on the tray, but her mind already moving ahead, calculating, adjusting, surviving the way she always had. Because moments like this were never just moments. They were tests, and she had learned a long time ago that passing the test did not always mean speaking. Sometimes it meant holding your ground without a single word. Behind her, a chair moved. Not loudly, but with purpose, a deliberate scrape against polished marble that cut through the music like a quiet signal. Conversation slowed, heads turned again, not toward the man who had spoken, but toward Ethan Cole, because when someone like him moves, rooms listen. He did not rush, did not raise his voice, did not need to. His presence carried weight the way a storm carries pressure, unseen but undeniable. He stepped forward with the kind of calm that made people uncomfortable. The kind that said this was not impulsive. This was chosen. Maya paused just slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to register that something was happening. Something different. Something no one in that room had expected. The man who had made the comment shifted in his seat, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Not because he regretted what he said, but because he was no longer sure he was the center of the moment. And that is where power begins to slip. Not in confrontation, but in redirection. Ethan stopped beside the table, his gaze steady, not harsh, not aggressive, just clear, the kind of look that does not ask for attention but takes it anyway. And for a second, no one spoke. Not the guests, not the staff, not even the music seemed to matter anymore. Maya turned now, slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time, and there was no pity there, no performance, just recognition. the kind that does not reduce a person to their role, the kind that sees beyond the uniform, and that alone was enough to make her inhale differently, deeper, steadier, as if something inside her had been acknowledged without being exposed. Ethan glanced at the empty chair at his table, then back at her, a small motion, almost nothing, but in a room built on status, it was everything. Because invitations in places like this were not given lightly. They were calculated, observed, remembered, and the people watching understood that. They felt it ripple through them. The realization that whatever happened next would not just be a gesture, it would be a statement. And statements from men like Ethan Cole did not stay in rooms like this. They traveled, they echoed, they rewrote. Reputations. The man who had spoken earlier shifted again, his confidence now uneven, his smile tighter, as if trying to hold on to something already slipping away. But Ethan did not look at him again, not because he could not, but because he chose not to, and that choice spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Maya stood there, tray still in her hands, the weight of it suddenly irrelevant compared to the weight of the moment, and in that suspended second, where time stretched, and I waited for the next move. One thing became clear to everyone watching. This was no longer about a waitress being dismissed. This was about who in that room truly understood what respect looked like when it was finally, unmistakably, given. For a moment, Maya did not move, not because she did not understand the gesture, but because she understood it too well. Invitations like that did not happen in places like this, not for someone like her, not in front of people who had already decided who she was before she even spoke. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier, not from weight, but from years of being overlooked, underestimated, quietly dismissed. And yet, her posture did not change, her shoulders stayed level, her chin steady, because dignity does not rush to be accepted, it waits to be recognized. And across from her, Ethan held his position, not insisting, not repeating himself, just waiting, giving her something rare in that room, a choice. And that was when the tension shifted again, softer this time, but deeper, because now it was no longer about what he would do. It was about what she would decide. A murmur passed through the guests, subtle, controlled, the kind of sound people make when they are witnessing something they do not fully understand but know they will remember. The man who had spoken earlier leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping against the table, a forced smile still on his face, but his eyes sharper now, watching, measuring, as if trying to predict an outcome he no longer controlled. Maya finally exhaled, a quiet breath that grounded her. And then she did something unexpected. She set the tray down carefully on a nearby service stand, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise, as if every movement mattered, because in that moment, it did. Every second was being observed, recorded, interpreted. She stepped forward, one step, then another, until she stood beside the chair Ethan had indicated, but she did not sit. Not yet. Instead, she looked at him directly, her voice calm when it came, steady, unshaken. "Sir, I am working," she said, not as a refusal, not as defiance, but as truth, simple and clear. And something in the room shifted again, sharper this time, because that was not the response anyone expected, not submission, not acceptance, but self-respect. Spoken without raising her voice, Ethan's expression changed, not into surprise, but into something quieter, something closer to approval, because he recognized what she had just done. She had not taken the invitation to escape her position, she had defined it on her own terms, and that was power, the kind that could not be handed over, only revealed. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, and then he did something that sent a ripple through the entire room. He reached for the chair himself, and pulled it back slightly, not for her to sit, but to reposition it beside the table, aligned, equal, not at the edge, not behind, but alongside. And then he spoke, his voice even, controlled, but carrying further than anyone expected. "Then stand here," he said, "because no one in this room should be spoken to like that." The words landed without force, but with weight. And this time, the silence that followed was different. It was not fragile. It was firm, grounded, the kind that settles after something true has been said. Maya held his gaze for a second longer, and in that look, something unspoken passed between them. Not agreement, not gratitude, but recognition. the kind that does not need to be explained, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance in the room shifted again, not in favor of wealth, not in favor of status, but in favor of something far more rare, something that could not be bought, only earned. And for the first time that night, the people watching began to understand that this moment was no longer about a comment or a reaction. It was about a line being drawn, quietly, clearly, in a place where lines like that were almost never seen. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and undeniable, and for a brief second, no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to what had just been said, because statements like that did not belong in places like this, not in rooms built on hierarchy, not in spaces where silence was often mistaken for agreement. Maya remained where she stood, her hands now free, her shoulders squared not in defiance, but in quiet alignment with something deeper, something that had been there long before this night. And across from her, the man who had spoken earlier shifted again, this time more noticeably, his confidence thinning at the edges, not collapsing, but cracking, because what had just happened was not loud, not dramatic, but it was undeniable, and people like him understood one thing above all else: when control slips, even slightly, everything else begins to follow. A woman at a nearby table glanced at her companion, whispering something under her breath, while another guest adjusted his posture, suddenly aware of how closely everyone was watching. Phones remained lowered, but attention was sharper than any lens, because this was no longer entertainment. This was exposure. Ethan did not return to his seat. Not yet. He remained standing, not towering, not imposing, just present, and that presence continued to reshape the space around him. He looked around the table briefly, not scanning, not judging, but acknowledging, as if reminding everyone there that they were part of this moment whether they intended to be or not. And then his gaze returned to Maya, not to direct her, not to guide her, but to stand with her, and that distinction mattered, because for the first time that night, she was not moving through the room unseen, she was standing in it, fully visible, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who could not be dismissed without consequence. The man across from her cleared his throat softly, a small sound, but one that carried more weight than his earlier words. He attempted a smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes, and said something about misunderstanding, about tone, about how things could be taken the wrong way, but the explanation felt thin, stretched, like fabric pulled too far, because everyone in the room had heard what was said, and more importantly, they had felt it, and now they were feeling something else, something quieter, but far more uncomfortable: accountability. Maya listened, not interrupting, not reacting, her expression steady, her eyes clear, and when he finished, she did not respond immediately. She did not rush to accept or reject what had been offered, because she understood something that many in that room did not. Respect is not repaired with words alone. It is revealed through change, and change takes time. The music in the background resumed its rhythm, but it sounded different now, less like decoration, more like a reminder that the night was still moving forward. Even if the room had not fully caught up yet, Ethan finally stepped back, slightly, not retreating, but allowing space. And in that space, something important happened. The balance did not snap back. It did not return to what it was before. Instead, it settled into something new, something that could not be undone by a single apology or a forced smile. Because once dignity is acknowledged in a place that tried to ignore it, it leaves a mark, invisible, but permanent. And as the conversation slowly began to resume, quieter now, more measured, one truth lingered in the air, not spoken, but understood. The rules in that room had just changed, and everyone there knew it, even if they were not ready to admit how or why. The room did not return to normal. It adapted, slowly, cautiously, like a system recalibrating after something unexpected. Conversations resumed, but carried a different tone now, quieter, more aware, as if every word had to pass through a new filter before being spoken. Maya remained where she stood for a few seconds longer, not out of uncertainty, but intention, because moments like this were not meant to be rushed past. They were meant to be acknowledged, even if only internally. And then, with the same calm precision she had shown all night, she reached for her tray again, lifting it with steady hands, returning to her role, but not shrinking back into it. There was a difference now, subtle but undeniable. She was still working, still moving between tables, but she was no longer invisible, and everyone in the room felt that, even if they pretended not to. Ethan finally returned to his seat, the chair sliding in quietly, his posture relaxed but his presence unchanged. He picked up his glass again, but did not drink immediately. Instead, he watched, not just Maya, but the entire room. The way people adjusted, the way their eyes flicked more carefully, the way their voices lowered just enough to signal awareness without admitting it. This was not about control for him. It never had been. It was about clarity, about seeing things as they were when the layers of pretense fell away, and tonight, those layers had shifted across the table. The man who had spoken earlier tried again to reclaim his footing, asking about the menu, commenting on the wine, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But the rhythm was off, the confidence slightly delayed, as if every sentence required an extra moment of thought, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, because power, once questioned, rarely returns in the same form. Maya approached another table, her movements fluid, her expression composed, but something had changed in the way she was seen. Guests who might have ignored her before now acknowledged her presence. A nod here, a brief thank you there, small gestures, but meaningful, because they were no longer automatic, they were conscious. And that made all the difference. One woman even paused before speaking, choosing her words more carefully, as if aware that respect was no longer optional in this space. And in the background, the staff noticed too, a subtle shift among them, a quiet understanding passing between glances, because they had seen this pattern before, moments where something unseen became undeniable, moments where the rules bent, even if just for a night, and those moments stayed with people longer than they expected. Ethan leaned slightly forward, speaking now, not loudly, but with purpose, guiding the conversation at his table without dominating it, asking questions that required more than surface answers, drawing attention away from status and toward substance. And gradually, the energy followed. The tension that had once been sharp began to settle into something more grounded, not comfortable, but honest, and honesty has a way of reshaping everything it touches. Maya passed by his table again, and this time, their eyes met briefly, no longer as strangers in a moment, but as two people who had shared something unspoken, something that did not need to be revisited or explained, just understood. And in that brief exchange, there was no hierarchy, no performance, just acknowledgement. And as the night continued, one quiet truth became clear to anyone paying attention: nothing dramatic had happened, no scene, no spectacle, and yet, everything had changed, not in a way that could be measured in dollars or deals, but in something far more lasting, the kind of shift that begins in a single moment and then moves outward, unseen, until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. By the time the main course arrived, the room had settled into a new rhythm, one that felt familiar on the surface but carried an undercurrent that no one could quite ignore. The kind of shift that lingers beneath polished conversations and carefully measured laughter. Maya moved between tables with the same precision, the same quiet grace, but something in the way people responded to her had changed in a way that could not be undone. A man who had earlier avoided eye contact now looked up and said thank you clearly, not out of habit, but intention. A couple at another table paused their conversation as she approached, giving her space instead of treating her as background movement. Small adjustments, almost invisible, but they added up. They always did, because respect rarely arrives all at once. It builds, moment by moment, choice by choice. Across the room, Ethan continued the discussion at his table, but his tone guided it somewhere different, away from numbers alone and toward people, asking not just what a deal could produce, but who it would affect, how it would shape lives beyond the balance sheet. And at first, the others followed cautiously, unsure how to respond to a shift that was not part of the usual script, but gradually, they leaned in, because when someone like Ethan redefines the direction, resistance becomes less comfortable than adaptation. The man who had made the earlier comment spoke less now, his contributions shorter, more measured, as if he were recalibrating his place within a structure that no longer felt as stable as before. And he watched Maya when she passed. not with dismissal, but with something closer to awareness, perhaps even reflection, though he would not have named it that. Maya noticed, not because she was looking for it, but because she had learned to read rooms the way others read numbers. She understood when energy shifted, when attention changed, when silence meant something different than before, and yet, she did not let it alter her rhythm. She continued her work with the same consistency, because true dignity does not perform for recognition. It exists whether it is seen or not, and that is what made it powerful. As the evening progressed, the lights dimmed slightly, casting a softer glow across the tables, the kind of lighting meant to make everything feel warmer, more intimate. But tonight it revealed something else. It showed faces more clearly, stripped of some of their earlier detachment. Conversations became less performative, more deliberate, and in that subtle transformation, the entire atmosphere shifted again. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Ethan leaned back in his chair, finally taking a sip from his glass, his gaze moving once more across the room, not searching, not judging, simply observing the ripple effect of a single moment, because he understood something many did not. Change does not announce itself. It unfolds, quietly, steadily, until one day it becomes the new standard. Maya returned to his table to clear a plate, her movements efficient, unhurried, and as she reached for the dish, Ethan spoke again, his voice low enough not to draw attention, but clear enough to carry intention. "Thank you for your professionalism tonight," he said, not as a formality, but as recognition, and Maya paused just briefly, meeting his eyes, her response simple, steady. "I always do my job well," she replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove anything beyond what was already evident. And in that exchange, something deeper settled. Not a transaction, not a favor, but a mutual understanding. And as she moved on to the next table, the room continued around her, conversations flowing, glasses clinking, deals progressing. But beneath it all, one quiet truth remained. The way people saw her had changed, and more importantly, the way they saw themselves in relation to her had changed too. And that was something no contract, no wealth, no status could ever fully control. As dessert plates began to replace dinner settings, the room carried a different kind of energy, not louder, not more relaxed, but more honest, the kind of honesty that does not need to be announced because it can be felt in the way people pause before they speak, in the way they look at one another just a second longer, as if measuring something beyond appearance or status. Maya noticed it in the smallest details, the way a guest gently moved their glass aside before she reached for it, the way another asked for her name instead of signaling with a gesture, and when she answered, "Maya," there was a brief nod, a quiet acknowledgement that held more weight than any tip ever could, because being seen is not about attention, it is about recognition, and recognition changes everything. Across the room, Ethan's table had shifted fully now. The conversation no longer centered on dominance or leverage, but on clarity, on decisions that carried meaning beyond profit. And while the others might not have realized exactly when it happened, the pivot was undeniable, because leadership is not always about speaking louder. Sometimes it is about choosing what not to tolerate. And once that boundary is set, everything around it begins to realign. The man who had spoken earlier finally set his glass down and leaned forward, his voice quieter now, more measured, not forced, but considered. He addressed Maya when she approached again, this time directly. "Miss, I apologize if my words earlier were inappropriate," he said, and while the sentence was simple, the shift behind it was not, because it was no longer about saving face, it was about adjusting perspective, and that distinction, though subtle, was real. Maya listened, her expression unchanged, not cold, not warm, just steady, and after a brief pause, she responded, "I appreciate that," her tone even, neither accepting nor rejecting more than what was given, because she understood that dignity does not require validation. It simply acknowledges truth when it appears, and then it moves forward. Ethan observed this exchange without interruption, his expression thoughtful, not satisfied, not impressed, just aware, because he knew something that most people in that room were only beginning to understand. Respect is not a single act, it is a pattern, and tonight was only the beginning of that pattern. The music softened further as the evening neared its close. Conversations became More reflective, less performative. Deals were still discussed, but with a different tone, one that carried an awareness that had not been there before. Maya moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same consistency. But inside, something had settled, not a sense of victory, not even relief, but alignment, the kind that comes when the world briefly reflects back the truth you have always known about yourself. And that kind of moment does not fade easily. It stays, it shapes, it strengthens. As the last plates were cleared and guests began to prepare to leave, Ethan stood once more, not to command attention, but because the night itself was reaching its natural end. He placed a card on the table, not dramatically, not for show, just as part of the process. And then he glanced once more across the room, his gaze finding Maya again, not searching, not lingering, just acknowledging. Because some moments do not need to be extended to be understood. And as people gathered, their coats and conversations turned toward departure, one quiet realization remained in the air, something that could not be undone by the closing of a bill or the end of a night. The value of a person had been made visible in a place that once tried to ignore it. And once that happens, even briefly, it leaves a mark that follows everyone who witnessed it, long after the lights dim and the doors close behind them. The doors did not close all at once. They opened slowly, one by one, as guests began to leave, their voices softer now, their steps less hurried, as if each of them carried something unspoken out into the night. Maya stood near the service station, organizing the final receipts, aligning silverware, completing the quiet rituals that marked the end of a shift. But tonight those routines felt different, not because the work had changed, but because the weight behind it had shifted. She could feel it in the way her shoulders rested, in the way her breath moved, steady and unforced, as if something that had always been there had finally been seen. Across the room, chairs emptied, glasses cleared, the polished space returning to its pristine state. But it was not the same room it had been hours earlier. Something invisible had been altered, something that would not show up in reports or summaries, but would linger in memory, in perception, in the subtle choices people made long after they left. Ethan remained a moment longer than the others, not out of obligation, but intention, his presence now quieter, less central, as if the role he had played earlier had already completed its purpose. He stood near the table, speaking briefly with a manager, his tone calm, direct, not seeking recognition, not inviting attention, just ensuring that what had been set in motion would not be dismissed as a passing moment. The manager nodded, more than once, his posture attentive in a way that suggested this was not a conversation to be forgotten. Maya noticed from a distance, not listening, not intruding, but understanding enough to recognize that something was being reinforced, not loudly, not publicly, but firmly. And that mattered, because change that is only visible rarely lasts. It is the quiet decisions behind the scenes that make it real. She finished stacking the final set of plates, placing them carefully onto the cart, her movements as precise as they had been at the beginning of the night. But now there was no trace of the earlier tension, no lingering hesitation, only clarity, the kind that comes when you no longer question your place, not because it has been given to you, but because you have always known it. Ethan turned then, his path leading him toward the exit, but as he passed by the service area, he slowed slightly, just enough to acknowledge her again, not with words this time, not with gestures that could be misinterpreted, just a simple nod, subtle, intentional, the kind that carries meaning without demanding anything in return. Maya met it with the same quiet steadiness, a small return of recognition, equal, unforced, and in that exchange, something closed, not abruptly, but completely. A moment that had begun with imbalance now settled into something far more grounded. Outside, the city moved as it always did, lights stretching across streets, engines humming, people continuing their own stories without pause. But inside that restaurant, something had shifted that would not stay contained, because the people who had witnessed it would carry it forward, in the way they spoke, in the way they chose, in the way they recognized or failed to recognize others in their own spaces. And as the final lights dimmed slightly, and the last guest stepped out into the night, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable: respect, once made visible, does not disappear. It travels, it repeats, and sometimes, it begins in the smallest of moments, with the simplest of choices, in a room where no one expected it to matter at all. Long after the last guest had disappeared into the night and the hum of the city reclaimed its rhythm, the restaurant stood in a kind of quiet that only comes after something meaningful has passed through. Maya moved through the final steps of closing, wiping down surfaces, aligning chairs, resetting the room for another night that would look the same on the surface but never truly be the same again. Because rooms remember, even when people pretend not to, and so do the people inside them. She paused for a moment near the center of the dining floor, not out of fatigue, but reflection, her eyes scanning the space where earlier that evening everything had shifted without warning, without announcement, and yet with absolute clarity. She did not smile. She did not sigh. She simply stood there, grounded in something that had nothing to do with approval or validation, something that had always been hers. Dignity does not arrive in moments like these. It reveals itself, and once revealed, it changes the way the world responds, even if only slightly, even if only at first. In another part of the city, conversations were already happening, small mentions, quiet retellings, a comment about the night, about what was said, about what was done, not exaggerated, not dramatized, but remembered, because authenticity does not need embellishment to travel. It moves on its own. Ethan stepped into the cool night air, the sound of the door closing softly behind him, his driver waiting, the car idling under the glow of streetlights. But he did not enter immediately. He stood for a second, looking out across the street as people passed by, strangers with their own stories, their own roles, their own unseen moments. And he understood something with a clarity that did not require explanation. Power is not proven by control. It is revealed by what you choose to correct when no one expects you to. He got into the car without another word, the door closing with a quiet finality, but the impact of the night did not end there, because it was never about the room, or the dinner, or even the moment itself. It was about what follows. Maya finished her shift, removing her apron, folding it carefully, placing it where it belonged, her movements unchanged, her routine intact, and yet, everything felt aligned in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud. As she stepped outside, the night air met her with a calm that mirrored her own. No applause, no recognition waiting, just the world as it always was, and that was enough. Because she did not need the world to change all at once. She had already seen what happens when even one moment shifts the way people see each other. And that is where everything begins, not in grand gestures, not in loud declarations, but in quiet decisions made in real time, in rooms where it would have been easier to say nothing, easier to look away, easier to let things remain the same. But someone did not, and because of that, something moved, something small, something real, and that is how change works. It does not arrive all at once. It builds, it spreads, it repeats, until one day, what once felt rare becomes expected, and what once felt invisible becomes impossible to ignore. She did not argue. She did not demand. She did not try to prove anything. She simply stood, and in doing so, she taught an entire room something money could never buy. That respect is not a privilege. It is a standard, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen.